Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, I would like to apologize at the outset for the laborious reading to get to the actual conclusion. He says, I have learned to pay attention to dreams, not least because of my training as a clinical psychologist. Dreams shed light on the dim places where reason itself has yet to voyage. I have studied Christianity a fair bit too, more than other religions, although I am always trying to redress this slack. Like others, therefore, I must and do draw more from what I do know than from what I do not. I knew that cathedrals were constructed in the shape of a cross, and that the point under the dome was the center of the cross. I knew that the cross was simultaneously the point of greatest suffering, the point of death and transformation, and the symbolic center of the world. That was not somewhere I wanted to be. I managed to get down out of the heights, out of the symbolic sky, back to safe, familiar, anonymous ground. I don't know how. Then, still in my dream, I returned to my bedroom and my bed, and I tried to return to sleep and the peace of unconsciousness. As I relaxed, however, I could feel my body transported. A great wind was dissolving me, preparing to propel me back to the cathedral, to place me once again in the central point. There was no escape. It was a true nightmare. I forced myself awake. The curtains behind me were blowing in over my pillows. Half asleep, I looked at the foot of the bed. I saw the great cathedral doors. I shook myself completely awake, and they disappeared. My dream placed me at the center of being itself. Is that really what it did? Did it really place Jordan Peterson at the center of being itself? That's his interpretation anyways. My dream placed me at the center of being itself, and there was no escape. It took me months to understand what this meant. During this time, I came to a more complete personal realization of what the great stories of the past continually insist upon. The center is occupied by the individual. The center is occupied by the individual. The center is marked by the cross, as X marks the spot. Existence at the cross is suffering and transformation, and that fact above all needs to be voluntarily accepted. It is possible to transcend slavish adherence to the group and its doctrines, and simultaneously to avoid the pitfalls of its opposite extreme nihilism. It is possible instead to find sufficient meaning in individual consciousness and experience. Is that correct? It is possible instead to find sufficient meaning in individual consciousness and experience. But all of the words that Jordan Peterson is making use of right now, the alphabet, the symbols, the phonetics, those are not the result of the individual. Those are the result of the group. They're the result of collective society proceeding and developing through history. It is possible instead to find sufficient meaning in individual consciousness and experience. I contest it is not possible to find that simply because the quality of an individual's life is contingent upon the society in which that individual exists, is contingent upon the social actions and processes, more specifically production processes, that allow that individual to have a quality existence. This scarf is not something that I made. I did not grow all of the food that I eat. So it's made up of my quality as an individual derives from the value and the productivity of others. Now this is where it gets over the top, and we see that Jordan Peterson is delusional. He has a kind of messianic, salvific delusion to his thinking. How could the world be freed from the terrible dilemma of conflict on the one hand and psychological and social dissolution on the other? So he thinks that this dream he's had has brought him to a place to see the ultimate solution to the conflict of the world. This is an exercise in mania. This is an exercise in one's own personal delusion. It is, in fact, taking one's individual conscious experience and elevating it to the point of a narcissistic delusion. How could the world be freed from the terrible dilemma of conflict on the one hand and psychological and social dissolution on the other? So this mighty interpreter of his dream is going to give us the answer. The answer was this: through the elevation and development of the individual and through the willingness of everyone to shoulder the burden of being and to take the heroic path. This seems like patent nonsense to me, but a better refutation is required than that. The answer was this: through the elevation and development of the individual. So let's discuss the elevation and development of the individual. What is required for an individual to elevate? What is required for an individual to develop? Is the thing that's required the fact that, or not the fact, but the claim that it is possible to find sufficient meaning in individual consciousness and experience? Certainly not without the necessity and value, the quality of the social. The individual. The answer is not the individual. The answer is that the individual draws from the social into which he or she is born. The answer is that the elevation of the individual, the development of the individual, talks about necessity, things that are necessary. If an individual wants to elevate, to rise up in his intelligence, his consciousness, his awareness, if an individual is going to develop qualitatively, then what is necessary for the individual? What Peterson is essentially putting forth here, that the thing that is necessary is the power of the will. So he says, and through the willingness of everyone to shoulder the burden of being and to take the heroic path. Language which we need to ask more questions about. What exactly is this heroic path that he's referring to? But this willingness, this idea that by the power of the will alone, by sheer determination, if one just has the right ideals, then one can derive a mastery of life, that one can elevate and ascend, that one can develop into quality. Now, this is false. This is false. There are millions upon millions of humans throughout the world who don't have a problem with the desire of their will. They have a problem with their social conditions. Their social conditions sabotage every desire to develop and elevate that they have. Therefore, the answer cannot be the individual. It is impossible for the answer to be the individual. And more than this, this path, this ideology of the individual, of the self-made individual who has pulled himself up and risen by his bootstraps, is a complete fallacy, is a complete delusion. This is the ideology that has been tried for the last 100 years in the world. It is dominated, really came into high-level prominence in American culture with the presidency of Reagan and the presidency of, not the presidency, but the leadership of Thatcher. And this is essentially what led humans, led the species down a path of destruction, because this consciousness right here that thinks that the answer to the conflict and social dissolution and all these problems we have, this person who tries to posit that the answer is individualism, is positing an ideology that was tried for a very long time and failed. It did not deliver on its promise, because one cannot elevate and one cannot develop through the domain of the individual. In order to elevate the individual and develop individuals, what is required is a qualitative social process. We can translate it even more specifically based on advances in economics. What is required is stable institutions that add to the well-being of the life of individuals. The answer is not an ideology or a philosophy of the individual. The answer is the formation of qualitative institutions. Institutions that aid humans in their progress of development, in their education, in their material, economic well-being. These are the things that allow the individual to elevate and develop. He says that through the willingness of everyone to shoulder the burden of being, but this is not what Jordan Peterson's ideology does. This is a form of idealism that is posed on the masses and makes a privileged, special pleading path for those who occupy places of wealth and power. What this is really saying is that individuals, the masses, must shoulder the heavy burden of meeting the necessities and needs of life, while those who are in positions of power, those who have inherited wealth, those who have inherited power, can exempt themselves from this process. They are allowed to hoard the wealth that the society has produced. They have not produced it. Individuals, no individual can produce wealth. It's impossible. It's empirically impossible for an individual to produce wealth. An individual, wealth can only be produced through the productivity of society. That is actually where wealth comes from. That is its empirical foundation and origin in the world. So Peterson says, everyone to shoulder the burden of being and to take the heroic path. We must each adopt as much responsibility as possible for individual life. Well, what does that mean? In Peterson's world, it simply means a will to power. But we know that that is not the case, because in order for an individual to elevate, in order for an individual to develop, that individual has to pass through a qualitative social process. Society matters to the well-being of the individual. Without society, there can be no individual. His life force will be stricken. Even those who live in the most isolated parts of the world and manage to have a quality of life, they rely on other people in the world to create the goods they need and supply the goods they need. There is no one who is self-sustaining. They do not make their own clothes. They do not make their own shoes. They do not make their own rifles if they're hunting food. They do not draw oil from the ground if they need it for vehicles. So the individual is always the result of a process, of a social process. We must each adopt as much responsibility as possible for individual life, society, and the world. This is true, but Jordan Peterson doesn't believe this. What he means by this is that he is going to impose this idea of responsibility onto everyone else. But those individuals who are hoarding the wealth of society, literally stealing the wealth of society, extracting this wealth and removing it from society and hoarding it unto themselves, these individuals are free from responsibility. Because in this system of individualism, this is really a system that worships and praises individuals that have wealth, individuals in positions of power. We must each tell the truth and repair what is in disrepair and break down and recreate what is old and outdated. Jordan Peterson doesn't believe this. He certainly doesn't believe this. His entire program is based upon adopting archaic myth beliefs and integrating an individual's life on the basis of those myth beliefs. It is not a position which seeks to recreate, to break down, and to overcome what is old and outdated. It is a position that seeks to cling to tradition, thinking that that tradition can save a society. And we've seen this before in the societies of fascism in the Third Reich. It's always the myth of the ancient past that creates this idea of saving the society from the future. It is in this manner that we can and must reduce the suffering that poisons the world. But the suffering that poisons the world is inequality. It's the fact that human beings are materially deprived of the goods they need to elevate and develop into the qualitative individuals they need to become. The suffering that poisons the world is not a refutation of individualism. It is not a negation of individualism or a moving away from individualism. The suffering that poisons the world is precisely this ideology of individualism imposed as the solution, as the salvation to the problems of the world. This is ultimately the problem that has caused the world to collapse into a state of material destitution and nihilism. It is in this manner that we can and must reduce the suffering that poisons the world. Jordan Peterson is not serious about any of this. This, in his words, in his mind, comes across as an ideology that appears to mean one thing on the surface, but means something else when you examine it beneath the surface. It does not actually mean the development of individual lives. It does not mean the protection and the nourishment of individual lives. What it means is the exaltation of the tried and failed ideology of individualism, the self-made man, the idea that we can posit individual willpower as the determining factor of quality. And what this does, this ideology, it makes the world into such a state that when we posit this notion of willpower, and willpower is what produces quality, then what we end up doing a very interesting thing. Wherever we see individuals in a position of power, we automatically assume that they ascended to that power because they pulled themselves up, because they exercised their indomitable will. And that's not the truth-telling that Jordan Peterson said we should be doing. The truth-telling of how these individuals get into power is that they inherit their power or they exploit other individuals to get into power. What we have learned from so many great economists in our time who are far more authoritative and educated than the likes of Jordan Peterson is that the crucial thing to the development and well-being of societies are laws that induce equality in society, are laws that protect the quality of institutions, thereby enabling the elevation and the qualitative development of the individual.